Namaste, everyone. Given that my past few videos have been about spirituality and my personal experiences with it, I wanted to bring up a topic that I feel isn't really discussed enough or discussed at all really in spiritual circles, and that is spirituality in regards to how it interacts with the lives of people with disabilities. And again, just to reiterate and re-emphasize, these are just my personal experiences. That's all I can do is share my personal story and hopefully reach out to whoever hears the message and take whatever you will from it, but just know this is just my own personal story. For those of you who don't know, I was born 3 months prematurely along with my twin sister, and the doctors gave us less than a 1% chance of survival. And if we did survive, they said we would basically be vegetables. I was the firstborn between the two of us, and instead of coming out of my mother as limp and lifeless and just sort of laying there, I came out crying my head off. Shortly after my sister and I were born, a few hours after we were born, the local minister from the church my mother went to came and did what's called an emergency baptism for my sister and I. So basically, I grew up in a spiritual household, a Christian household. And when I look back on how I envisioned this great spirit, this life force that people called God, and again, this is when I was about maybe 4 or 5 years old, like is the earliest back that I can remember. But since this great spirit had made all of nature and all the animals, I envisioned what might be called now the Green Man, the figure with the long shaggy hair with leaves in his hair, who was dressed in natural colors, browns, grays. I envisioned that sort of a figure, and I envisioned that what people called God, it wasn't just a male figure, it was a male figure and God had a wife. Even though as a 4-year-old I obviously didn't understand all the biological processes of that, you put together as a kid, well, if there's obviously a mommy and a daddy for everything, obviously both those components are important. So when I envisioned the great spirit that had made everything, all of the earth, all of the universe, I envisioned that spirit as being two entities, I guess you could say, a mother and a father. And I pictured that divine couple as rejoicing in everything that came into being, every blooming flower, every baby animal, every human, just everything brought them joy, and they saw everything as beautiful. And I remember when I went and saw Pocahontas in theaters as a 6-year-old, and there's that scene where Grandmother Willow says to Pocahontas, "Spirits are all around you. They're in the earth, in the water, in the sky. Listen for them in the wind, in the sounds of the animals. Listen for them in your heart, and they'll guide you." Something within me clicked and went, yes, that's right. That's exactly how I've always innately seen the divine, and that's how it is. And I also had a very strong, innate sense of the spirit, the essence of complete, unconditional love, and of that spirit that completely embraced life and lived life for its highest good and for the highest good of everyone around them. And when I went to Sunday school, when I went to church, and we started going when I was about 4 or 5, again, very, very young, I was told that that spirit was embodied in a man named Jesus. So I went, oh, okay, that's the spirit of divine love, and I've always had a strong love for Jesus because of that. But when I was in Sunday school as a very young child, and there would be lessons about Jesus, and the people in the stories would be amazed when Jesus taught about unconditional love, and you treat someone the way you want them to treat you. When the people would be astonished at that and seem surprised and seem to have never thought of that, my little 5-year-old brain went, "You're an idiot. How can you be so surprised at that? Shouldn't people innately know how to be good people? Why do you think that you have to be taught that?" So that's why, even as a kid, when I got older, I found out what the concept of original sin was, and I never bought into it. I never thought a loving God could curse every little baby to be born with the curse of original sin. I think we all come into this world completely innocent. Maybe we have karmic things to work out, but they're not punishments. They're not us, innocent children, being punished for something our ancestors did years and years ago. And also, I think the story of Adam and Eve is meant to be an allegory, but I'm getting off topic. That's a whole other video. Anyway, I never bought into original sin. So the idea that people have to be taught how to be good and how to be kind, that never made sense to me, even as a child. But I did have this innate sense of unconditional love, and that we're all born with that, and that unconditional love physically manifested into the figure we know as Jesus of Nazareth. And I can't really remember when I first heard the story of Jesus healing someone with a disability, and I can't even remember if it was specifically the story where Jesus heals the blind man, but I remember being completely confused because I felt in my heart that the Great Spirit had made everything exactly as it was meant to be made. So when I heard the story of Jesus healing someone who wasn't sick, but just was different in the sense that their body worked differently, I was so confused by that as a child, because I was thinking, wait a minute, God, you're supposed to have made everything perfect. That's what they tell us. You made the world and it was perfect. You made the animals and they were perfect. Everything you make is perfect the way it is. Why am I suddenly being told that apparently something or someone that you made wasn't perfect? And why is it that your son has to come along and make that person perfect? I didn't understand it, and it seemed it didn't make sense to me. But as a child, I thought, well, okay, if that's what the grown-ups say, it must be true. I don't really know what the truth of it is, but there must be some truth to it, because if it's what the grown-ups say, and if it's in this big book, that the grown-ups say is the actual word of God, there must be some truth to it. So obviously I must be wrong. So I'll just wait and see if that truth reveals itself to me. And as I got older, I started to see how those stories affected people in the congregation and how they affected me. We went to a lot of different churches when I was growing up because we moved a lot when I was a kid. So we would go to, the local church of the town. And the churches we went to were always very progressive churches. My mother is a very progressive, very loving, open-minded woman, and I come from a very open-minded spiritual family who they always taught me to value love over dogma, to value that no matter what name or face you put to the divine, as long as however the divine manifests to you inspires you to be a good person and to follow the golden rule and to treat yourself and others kindly, and to treat this world we live in as kindly as you possibly can, then that path leads to the divine. So I come from a very open-minded, very loving, spiritual family. But no matter what church we went to, I always felt strange going into it, because no matter what church or congregation or town we were in, there was always that sense that I was walking in as a modern example of the poor, blind person. I don't know how else to describe it, because even when I started to realize that Jesus' healing of people who are blind was taken metaphorically, that metaphor was always that poor person couldn't see before. They were born with not being able to spiritually see, and now they can, which made me even more confused, because I was like, what? Why would... Okay, it's one thing to say that humans are born with original sin. That's one thing to say, that humans are born with the innate want to do bad things. It's another thing to say that some humans are born spiritually stunted or spiritually blind, and not only are they born with that, which is a pretty awful thing for any supposedly all-loving creator to do, not only are they born that way, they're born in a body that physically reflects that, so everyone can see that. What kind of a sick message is that to send to an innocent child who, up until you started to put that message in her head, had absolutely nothing against her own body or her own sense of what the divine was? And not that that message was ever blatantly or directly said in a sermon, but when you keep drilling the same metaphor into kids' heads, they pick up on it. And so, by the time we moved back to San Diego, which is where I had been born, and started going to the church my mother went to growing up, where the minister who baptized my sister and I still worked, by the time we started going to that church, I was starting to get suspicious and starting to wonder questions, but I'd never ask them, because again, I still had that mentality of, well, I must be wrong if these learned, educated, religious men and women who were teaching from the pulpit, if this was their message and this is what they said, the Bible said, obviously I'm just a kid, I must be wrong. And when we moved back to San Diego, my sister and I were going into middle school, and this church that we went to was so warm and open and loving. I absolutely loved it, and I ate up everything I was told, every little crumb, every little morsel, because they seemed to embrace Jesus' message, which I always felt was the foundation of Christianity, of love and kindness, no matter what, because that's what I was told is what it was, and that's what I innately felt in my heart. And the minister who baptized us did most of the sermons, and he is one of the most warm, loving, patient, understanding men I've ever met. He embodied what it meant to be a Christian, in the sense that he was so warm and so kind and loving to everyone. And I felt so at home in that church. I volunteered to be an acolyte to help during the services, because I wanted my spiritual participation to be more participatory, and to not just sit in the pew passively every Sunday, to just be a receptacle of, well, this is what we're being taught today. I wanted to be a part of it. And all the sermons I agreed with, and all the messages of love and kindness I agreed with. So my fears and my wonders of, well, maybe this image of God as someone who makes some souls a certain way and makes some other ways just because he's God, maybe that image of God as that kind of toy master making little toys to play with. Maybe that's not the right image of God. Maybe God is as loving and as kind as his son Jesus is, and is as loving and as kind as I innately felt as a 4-year-old when I would picture God as being in nature and looking as if he just came out of nature, out of the forest, with leaves in his hair and with his bride, Mother Earth, by his side. So since this church seemed to reflect that image and was bringing me out of my past fears and doubts, of the stereotypes about myself that had been drilled into my head, and that, I was starting to feel more at home and more calm, and so I ate up everything that the church ministers told me as the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then, I've never really shared this story, and so it's going to be hard to talk about, but one Sunday, it was my turn to acolyte. There were a couple of acolytes, and we, took turns each Sunday depending on the schedule that we got sent each week. Every month you served a certain number of Sundays. And on this particular Sunday, I was sitting, when the acolytes weren't doing their jobs, we were sort of sitting off to the side of the altar, and we would sit and listen with everyone else. And the sermon that was being given that day was by the minister who had baptized my sister and me. And his sermon was about Father Damien of Molokai, a 19th century Catholic priest who went from his native Belgium to the Hawaiian island of Molokai to live in the colony of people who had been quarantined because they had Hansen's disease, or what's historically been known as leprosy. And the minister, he showed through his sermon how Father Damien did all these wonderful things to improve the lives of the patients who lived in the colony. But he painted the patients as people who were ill and who were there to be taken care of and there to help Father Damien reach his eventual sainthood. And of course, at the time these people were quarantined, they needed care, they needed help. But to paint them as that was their only purpose in life, was to be born to become sick so that they could be cared for, so that their caretaker could become a saint. By the time the sermon was over, I was so hurt and so angry, and I had so many confusing emotions. I couldn't have expressed them at the time, even if I had wanted to. I was so livid. And it was then that I realized no matter what church I go to, no matter what progressive minister I listen to, even if it's the very minister who is so kind and loving and brought me into the faith I was a part of, when I was only hours old and clinging to life, no matter what minister I listened to, if one of the foundations of Christianity is the idea that physical disability is a metaphor for spiritual stunting or lack of spiritual growth, no matter then what church I go to, I'll never be at home in any church. I could never reject Christ or his teachings because I feel that his teachings are universal. His teachings of love are completely universal, couldn't be found anywhere and through any means. But if churches, and I mean churches in the plural, if churches' vision of God are of the sage in the sky who isn't even within the creation that he created, even not even within nature, within the world he created, but he's in this distant realm, far, far away, far up in the sky. If he's so removed from that, if that's Christianity's, or as I later came to call it, churchianity's vision of God, that's not the vision of God I feel in my heart. And so when I would go to church and I would pray, I always had a clear image of Jesus, but I couldn't picture the Father anymore. I didn't know who I was praying to. I couldn't picture an image of the Father, the Creator, in my head. I could feel God in my heart as the spirit of that ancient spirit that's older than anything else, that is wise and kind and loving and creates out of pure love, the way an artist creates. I always had that feeling of God in my mind, but the fundamental Christian view of a God who makes souls a certain way and then is a disciplinarian to those souls, in the sense that, well, you're spiritually stunted here, you have to go through this certain vein in order to cure yourself of this spiritual stunting that I had you be born with. That wasn't the image of God that I felt in my heart. And so whenever I would hear stories in church that harkened back to that, about the healing of people with disabilities, in that sense, that that's what their healing meant, I was so angry, and I'd be like, that's not the word of God. That is not what that story means. You have no idea what you're talking about. I don't care if you've spent 20 years in seminary school or however long it is. You have to study to be a priest. That's not the image of God. You don't understand. Until you walk in my shoes as someone with a disability who was born with no concept of feeling any sense of anything wrong spiritually with herself or physically with herself, you'll never understand. You have no idea what you're talking about. But I internalized that anger and I kept it to myself because, of course, I was still a young kid, again, only 14, 15 years old, and I assumed that my elders knew more than me. And because it was in the Bible, it knew more than I did. So I would pray to Jesus and ask him, please show me what these stories really mean. What do they mean? What is my life supposed to tell through these stories? Because obviously I am an embodiment of a character from those stories. What do they mean? What is the image of the Father? What does that image even mean? What does the image of the Creator even mean? So I prayed and I asked, and I went through a lot of anger at the society that I felt didn't understand me. And when I was about 14, 15 years old, I came across a story that, with no exaggeration, saved me from that anger. And it wasn't a story that was in the Bible, but it was a story that was written less than 100 years ago at the time that I first found it. It was a story of a little boy who had been born into a world that didn't understand him. He was born with a face unlike anything anyone had ever seen. He had drum-tight skin that was stretched across his face. He had deep sunken yellow eyes. He had no nose, and he was bald on his head except for a few locks of dark hair. And he traveled the world, always on the run, learning everything he could, but always on the run because he was always running from the people's fears of him. And he eventually settled into the basement of the local opera house. And he fell in love with a young singer and tried to show his love for her, not always in ways that were acceptable, of course, but the point was he tried to show his love, to show that he could love like any other human. He needed love as all humans do. He deserved love as all humans do, and he wanted to live as all humans do. And that story was The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. And that story saved me from all the anger I was feeling. It showed me I was not alone, that God makes every person exactly as they're meant to be made. I innately saw the stories of Jesus healing people with disabilities as showing that they had been born with unique insights, with unique gifts, that they didn't need their physical bodies to work as everyone else's did because they had those gifts. And the physical healing was a metaphor for everyone else around them seeing those gifts, seeing through what they thought were physical defects. And again, not that it was ever blatantly said in any of the churches I went to, or said with any malicious intent, but the fundamental Christian attitude of disability being a metaphor for spiritual stunting was something I'd grown up with on a subconscious level. And even on a conscious level, people come up to me all the time and offer healing prayers on the street without even introducing themselves or saying hello. They just come up to me. Do you need me to pray for your healing? And so Phantom reached out to my soul and saved it from the anger, which is why it infuriated me when I would come across versions that paint the Phantom, or Eric as he's named in the original book, when I would come across versions that equate him to Faust, or even worse, even the devil himself, but that's a whole other video. So I was healing through that story. I was healing from my past anger and hurt. But I found that, again, no matter what progressive branch of Christianity or progressive individuals in Christianity I found, that image of the poor blind beggar was always following me. I couldn't seem to get away from it. And so I started thinking, well, Jesus' message of love and kindness and peace, all those things, living your life through those things unconditionally, those are universal. Those can be found in the human heart innately. Children are born with that, and as they get older, they learn to adopt biases and prejudices and all those things. But those things are found in every major religion, every major spiritual path, because I feel that all spiritual paths come from the same source. And I thought, well, if I can't escape this shadow of this metaphor that I don't fit into, and yet the fundamentalists of this faith keep trying to fit me into it, maybe what's called the Christian path is no longer aligned with. So I was researching different spiritual paths and different mythologies, and just going about my merry way, being the little scholarly bookworm that I was. And then around that time, the scandal, the pedophile scandal of the Catholic Church broke out. And that, of course, got everyone asking questions and everyone wondering, well, if the church was so corrupt and so far removed from what Jesus' teachings were, that it could hide something like this and seem to have absolutely no qualms about it. There's something wrong here in this system, and something needs to be, we need to re-examine what exactly all these fundamental principles and fundamental beliefs are, and even the structure of the system in general. There needs to be, we need a doctor in here, because this system is obviously very, very sick. And it's a system that people have been putting their spiritual trust in, and it obviously is no longer living up to what people are trusting it to do. And again, just to point out, I wasn't raised Catholic. I didn't go to Catholic Mass. I was raised in the Episcopal Church. But even so, during that time, I think everyone was questioning not just the Catholic Church as an institution, but then wondering about other branches of Christianity, because obviously it all started with the Catholic Church. So at that point, one of the things that was getting a lot of media attention was Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code. And my mom and I both read it. We kind of had our own little two-person book club where we read it together, and we absolutely loved it and just thought it was amazing. And for me, it brought up the idea that went back all the way back to my childhood as a 4-year-old, where I believed innately that the divine is both God and goddess. And so reading Dan Brown's work of how the goddess was repressed in Christianity in favor of earthly male patriarchy, in favor of what people at that time thought the Bible meant, claiming male superiority, which is complete nonsense. But again, that's a whole other video. It made me say to myself, aha, see, I was right. There is more nature reverence and feminine reverence to Christianity that was originally there and was lost as Emperor Constantine and the people after him and the people under his wing, as they all took Christianity, which in its beginning stages had all different kinds of beliefs and all different kinds of opinions, took that and packaged it into a nice, neat, little digestible tablet. A tablet which, of course, would serve the emperor and the aristocracy and would keep a certain earthly societal structure. So that reinstated in my heart, yes, I believe Creator is both God and Goddess. And going back to the theme of people with disabilities, I found in various other faiths, pre-Christian faiths, stories of people with disabilities that were seen in a positive light. For example, the two stories I can think of now off the top of my head. The first one I learned came from Norse mythology and was the story of Odin, who at the time was a young prince, a young god prince, and he had heard that there was this well that you could go to, a magical well, and if you drank from it, you would have all the wisdom you would ever need. And so, of course, knowing that he was going to be king, he thought, well, that seems like a pretty useful thing to have. So he went to the well, and he asked the well keeper if he could have a drink. And the well keeper said, yes, but I need something in return. And Odin said, well, all right, what is it? And the well keeper said, you need to gouge out one of your eyes and throw it in the well, because you won't understand this wisdom that you're going to acquire if you're completely rooted in what you can physically see. And I absolutely love that story. I'm like, yes, finally there was a culture that actually understood what it means to have, I don't even like the term disability. I think we need to get rid of that and use different ability, because really the only time that having lack of sight or whatever physical thing is a disability is when it's compared to people who have all their earthly senses. On its own, it's not a disability. It's nothing lacking. It's just a variation. So I was like, yes, someone who finally understands it. And of course, that culture is now gone, because of course Europe was Christianized and everything. And again, this is not a bash on Christianity. It's just that the original message of Jesus and his teaching has been lost over the years. But again, more on that later. And the other story I heard was the story of Sedna, who is the Inuit goddess of sea creatures. She was a beautiful Inuit girl who one day went on a canoe trip with her father, and they were trapped in a storm. And to save himself, Sedna's father threw her into the ocean, and she grabbed onto the side of the kayak and held onto it and wouldn't let go, and her father hit her fingers to make her let go, but she wouldn't. But eventually, the cold turned her fingers into icicles, and so when he struck her fingers again, her fingers shattered and she fell down into the bottom of the sea, with the little twinkling icicle fingers following after her. And when she got down to the bottom of the sea, she saw there was nothing down there, because at that point there were no marine mammals, there was nothing in the ocean. And so Sedna thought to herself, well, if this is going to be my new home, I don't want to be alone. And she looked up and she saw the icicle fingers following down after her. And so she turned all the icicle fingers that were floating down into all the creatures of the sea, into whales, otters, everything that lives in the ocean. And again, that's another story where a physical difference is seen in a positive light, and it in fact gave birth to all the creatures of the ocean. And so I love that story. And so as I read all these stories of these various mythologies from their original cultures, I started to wonder, well, maybe in my heart, maybe I'm what's called a pagan. I knew that neo-paganism was a thing, and as I read more about it, paganism, it's a very individual path, so every person who calls themselves pagans has their own views, and there's no set dogma or doctrine. I mean, they have a few things they agree on, but it's not like Christianity where here's these certain things you have to agree on. But for the most part, most pagans I know of and who I've talked to, the gods to them are the personifications of nature. We know obviously the scientific reasoning behind a tree growing, but the divine is the energy of that tree growing. It's all things that grow. They believe in Mother Earth as the goddess, and most believe in some sort of nature god who is depicted typically as a horned god with the antlers and sometimes the other body parts of a stag. And that image long ago was taken and misinterpreted as the image of the devil, because that the god of nature is often identified with the trickster. Most indigenous cultures don't divide good and evil as sharply as the Christian or Abrahamic faiths do. There's the force of nature, the life within nature, and then there's the trickster god who brings chaos or order to a situation depending on what the situation is. I mean, if you think about it, that seems more true to life. Rain in just the right amount is good, but if there's too much rain, that causes a flood and that kills the crops. So there never was or never is any devil figure in paths that are considered pagan. They had their trickster gods, and that was the extent of, the troublemaker, but they didn't cause trouble out of a want to do bad things. But when Christian missionaries came and they saw these people explain, oh well, if something unusual happens, that's the work of the trickster god, they misinterpreted that as, well, because that god is purely good and is causing chaos, that must be the devil. So it's all down to misinterpretation. So there was never any source of evil in paganism. And in fact, most pagan paths believe that we have the responsibility to use our free will to choose to do good or bad. There's no outside forces driving us to do either way. It's all completely on us. If we do good, wonderful. If we do bad, then that'll come back to haunt us. So with all these things in mind, with my love of nature coming back into me, with my reaffirming in my heart that yes, I believe in I don't see the divine as a single parent with wanting to figure out who the feminine divine was for me. I began to wonder if really, if in my heart I was what was called a neo-pagan. And in the back of my mind there was, of course, again, that voice of the fundamental Christian saying, if you don't identify as Christian anymore, you're going to go to hell, you're going to... all these awful, awful things that they drill into you as a kid. And so that really obviously scared me. Obviously, and of course, and also too, nothing could ever replace Jesus in my heart. His love, his kindness, his compassion, his teachings, nothing can ever replace them once you know them. But again, as I've said before, I felt that his teachings had been lost, and I was looking for a path that better seemed to reflect them, because they didn't seem to be in any Christian denomination that I could find. And so I started to wonder, well, if I can't see the spiritual truth in any set path, maybe I need to make one of my own and take different elements from different faiths, which, as I've said before, I think they all come from the same source. Maybe I need to take those elements and forge a path that works for me. And so, to make a very long story short, I've been working out with that over the past few years especially. And this past Good Friday, I felt, again, at a crossroads where I felt really confused, because around the season of Lent, and especially Holy Week and Good Friday, it's always struck me as odd that in remembering what Jesus went through on the cross, to quote or to paraphrase the words of Bishop John Spong, his last name spelled S-P-O-N-G, to paraphrase him, he said, how can we believe in a God that says, come, through the example my son said, come live your highest good, be the best version of you that you can be? How can we do that if we constantly go to church each week, and especially during Easter season, and remind ourselves what horrible, wretched sinners we are? Those thoughts had always been with me. I mean, that seems like basic psychology 101. You can't live life to the fullest and be the kindest, most loving version of yourself if you're constantly going back to beating yourself down of, I'm such a horrible person, I've done all these horrible things. I mean, it's one thing to feel immediate regret and remorse, or remorse for something you've done years ago, but to keep purposefully bringing yourself back to feeling awful and feeling bad and beating yourself down. I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner. Thank God that I'm being rescued from being such a horrible person and being stuck in this horrible life that's a punishment for original sin. You know, that's never made sense to me, and that seems contradictory to what God wants us to do in living our lives to the fullest through following Jesus' example. So with all these things in mind, with everything, with wondering what my personal role is, what my personal path is, what Jesus' entire message was, particularly what the message of the crucifixion and resurrection meant, I sat down this past Good Friday to do Sarah Hall's Healing with Jesus meditation. I had done it many times before. It had brought wonderful comfort, but this time I sat down and I prayed beforehand. I said, Jesus, God, Goddess, please guide me to the answers of these questions I've been having in my heart. I really need your guidance. I really need to know what these answers are. And I went deep into a meditative state, much deeper than I'd ever gone before. You could have pretty much hit me with a baseball bat and I wouldn't have moved. That's how into meditation I was. And I felt myself taken to a place that was so happy and loving and just absolutely full of the fullest love and warmth and welcome you could ever imagine. I could never put it into words, but it was warm and welcoming and just so peaceful, and I felt a great presence around me that was made up of a bunch of little presences, like all the spirits of all the people. You know how Emerson talks about the oversoul, which is all the souls of all the people are make up one great soul. Like, again, as I've used before, the metaphor of we're all the crystals of a chandelier. And I felt those presences around me. I felt God and Goddess with me, and that they were two distinct, separate entities, but they were part of one spirit, almost like if you can imagine a wave constantly flowing through yourself. That's what it felt like. Was the wave was made up of different currents of water, but it was the same wave. And I felt Jesus's presence, and I was told in my mind, I could feel my third eye opening and just having this information stream through into my third eye. I may be speaking a bit slowly, so bear with me. I've never put this into words. So first I was made to feel, I'm not sure that's how to describe it, but I was made to feel that yes, the Creator is in the life of all nature. That yes, there is a mother and father element. There are mother and father elements to that one great Creator. And yes, of course, that Creator manifests to different people in different ways, and each way leads back to it. And then I was made to feel that my instincts about people like me were right, that the metaphor in the biblical stories of them being physically healed was showing their unseen, unappreciated gifts, where it was a metaphor for people seeing those gifts finally. So that cleared my heart so that I could be told the other answers to my questions. And I was made to feel that while there was no doubt that the historical Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, and there was no doubt that it was a horrible, horrible experience, but I was made to feel that, like everything else he did in his earthly life, that was an example Jesus was setting. That we are not born in sin. We are not born broken in any way. But as we go throughout the world, we learn to see ourselves in that way because of guilt and shame and fear and all the things that are natural to feel as humans, but they're the great illusion of us being separated from the divine, when in spiritual truth, nothing ever separates us from the divine, because we are the divine, because we were made by the divine and sent here by the divine, because the divine is life itself. And so the crucifixion was Jesus's ultimate triumph. While it was a physically awful ordeal, yes, but it was not a tragedy. It was him living so fully and loving so much that he was able to love to the point where it gave his life away. And that's not to say that through the crucifixion Jesus was showing that we all have to die a horrible death, that we have to give our lives away by dying a horrible death. No, it means giving your life away in love, in being as kind and as caring and as compassionate as you can possibly be, of transcending guilt and fear and shame and confusion and doubt and all the things that are what we call demons or the devil, or things that keep us from reaching our own individual highest good and from helping others reach their own highest good. It's all about love and understanding that we are love, and by living in love, by throwing love out to the world like it's the most abundant, plentiful thing you can find, because it truthfully is. The divine is love and creation is love. By doing all those things, you transcend the human ego that's the illusion of separation from the divine, and you step out anew and full of life, as full as you could possibly be. Your spirit feels like it can't be contained in your body, and just everything you see and know on earth brings you joy, and any negativity that comes your way, you can turn it into love by showing it love. That's what the resurrection is. Jesus, through his final earthly acts, was again living as an example. It wasn't a sense of being a sacrifice in the way that it's traditionally viewed. He was living as an example by showing that he could be beaten and crucified because of human fear and jealousy and anger and all the reasons that the authorities crucified him. He was showing this is what happens when the human soul is stuck in all those things, is stuck in hell. Hell is not a physical place. It's a psychological state of the human spirit being so fooled by the illusion of being separated from the divine through mistakes and shame and all those things that it gets stuck there. But by transcending through showing love, you can move out of that psychological state and move to a psychological and spiritual place where nothing negative can touch you. Absolutely nothing. Where there's only love, where you know only love, and where love is all you can give to the world. There's no other choice. No other choice exists. Jesus was showing an example to everyone, no matter what spiritual path they walk. It was a universal example. And coming into the world and learning to feel broken is not in alignment with spiritual truth. That there is only love, that any negativity is an illusion brought on either by your own fears or by people acting based on those fears. But in truth, there is only love. And as long as we focus on only the physical and only keep going back to our guilt and shame as a way to reach God, in the sense of, oh, I'm such a horrible person, forgive me by bathing me through the wounds and the blood of your son. I mean, that's really sadistic. But once you see the physicality of the crucifixion and the resurrection as symbols and ways for humans to understand that our soul is constantly going through that process of being trapped, feeling guilty, feeling ashamed, feeling less adequate, and then transcending that through love and realizing that we are children of the divine, and because of that we are divine and have sparks of the divine within us, and we therefore transcend all the fears and all the things that aren't in alignment with spiritual truth. And so we keep being resurrected over and over again as we go through all the trials and tribulations of life. Once you see the crucifixion story as a metaphor for the transcendence of the human soul, it aligns up much more with the idea of an all-loving God who would never let anything happen to his children. That was the message I received in my meditation on this past Good Friday. And I sat there after all this had been told to me, and I was so elated and so full of joy. I can't describe it. I'd never felt this kind of ecstatic, intense joy before. No church service had ever made me feel this happy. And so I sat there for a few moments just drinking this in, just soaking this in like a sponge, and I just sat there and was just so amazed and so overwhelmed and so happy and so grateful for this revelation. And I finally, after I had collected myself a bit, I asked in my mind, what do I do now? And I immediately got the answer, go share this. Go tell this to everyone. You need to share this. You need to share this piece of truth that we've given you, because this is what the story is all about. This is what being human and being both human and divine are all about. To quote the Da Vinci Code, why does it have to be human or divine? Maybe human is divine, and it is divine. And so I was told, you need to share this. You need to spread this message everywhere you can, in the stories you write, in living your life. You need to share this truth. So that's why I made this video, to share my own story and my own journey I've gone through and am still going on. But as for my own path, I walk what some may call a blended path. I don't use this term for myself, but I'm what would be considered a Christo-pagan. I take the elements of Christianity, which, as I've just explained, are much more mystical and universal than what traditional interpretations give it credit for. I take those elements and I use them alongside my reverence for nature, for God and Goddess, for the fairies, for the elements, for all those wonderful good things. That's the path that I walk, and that's the path I'm learning to walk. Hopefully I want to learn more about crystal work and working with herbs and things like that, but that's the path I walk. And whatever path you walk, whatever traditions you hold dear, use them and know them. Use them in love, know that they come from love. Use them to inspire yourself and others to love. If your beliefs change, that's okay. The human soul is changing all the time, and being stuck in any routine in any other area of life wouldn't be considered healthy. So why should our spiritual lives be any different? No matter what body you're born into, different, whether it's a body like mine or one with all its senses, but for whatever reason you're seen as strange. For every human being, you are loved. God and Goddess love you so much, no matter what name or face you put to the divine loves you, and you are that love. And if you live in that love, nothing can touch you. No negativity will ever hurt you or make you doubt yourself or anything else ever again. And to those of you who are ministers of whatever faith, please know that there are metaphors to the stories, because someday you're going to get someone with a disability in your congregation, and they may have the same questions that I have, and so you need to know that it's metaphors that they have a gift, and that you seeing through what may be viewed by science and by spiritual communities as physical limitations, that you showing them that their physical limitations don't hold them back, not meant to be used as limitations, as long as you show them that. That's the truth. So, I love you all. I hope you all are going to wake up and realize that, and walk in love and light, and live in love and light. So that's my message, that's my story. I know this video is really long by this point. If you stuck with me to the end, thank you so much. Namaste, blessed be, I love you all. God and Goddess be with you all. And I love you, my brothers and sisters of the universe. I love you all.